Hello, everybody. Hello, Joe. Hello, Marcus. Thank you so much for making the time to be here with us today. Let me start by thanking the German Marshall Fund. The event today is organized in partnership between the two institutions, the German Marshall Fund and Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso. It's not the first one we do together. We go back a long way. Since 2016, we have been organizing joint discussions on global issues. And once again, I would like to thank the GMF for this partnership, which we will carry on in the years to come. Ian Lesser, who is the Vice President of GMF and the Executive Director of its office in Brussels, will be joining us along the way. As everybody knows, we are now 1 year into the war in Ukraine, and unfortunately with no end in sight for the conflict. In this context, we thought it would be too speculative to explore possible geopolitical scenarios that might prevail when peace is finally reached. So we decided to mark the 1 year anniversary of the war with a more down-to-earth discussion. Food and energy prices are the main channels through which the war in Ukraine is affecting the lives of people, companies, governments, central banks, etc. worldwide. The event today is comprised of two panels, one on food security and the other on energy. I will be moderating the first one with two top-notch participants, both with a formidable experience and knowledge on global food markets. Marcus Yankee, who is the head of the INSPIR Agribusiness Global Center. And for those who doesn't know, INSPIR is among the top 3 private universities in Brazil. Marcus is also a board member of various agribusiness companies. And Joseph Glauber, United States Department of Agriculture ex-chief economist, and now senior research at the Food Policy Research Institute. The second panel will feature Clarissa Lins, ex-head of the Brazilian Institute of Oil and member of the Global Council on the Future of Energy of the World Economic Forum, and Elena Rybakova, chief economist of the Institute of International Finance. And the second panel will be moderated by Jacob Kierkegaard, senior fellow at the GMF. Each participant will have up to 50 minutes to make his or her presentation. A conversation will follow with selected questions from the public being brought by me to the table. We're going to have a 10-minute, we're running on a tight schedule today. So we're going to have a 10-minute break between the first and the second panel. And let me, last but not least, thank the sponsors of Fundação Fernando Henrique Cardoso annual program of seminars. I thank all and each of them. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor to Joe Glauber for 50 minutes. Joe, the floor is yours.
So let me share my screen. I think I'm just going to start here. I'll try to go very quickly. I have a lot of slides, but I think if I can get through this quickly, we can. So first of all, the slide advance. Am I on the second slide now? Do you see a chart with grains and fertilizer?
Oh yeah, that's it.
Okay, good, perfect. Okay, so it's just to say that prices have fallen a lot over the last 8 months, but they still remain high. So I have here fertilizer prices, grain prices, and energy prices. Here I've deflated them by the CPI index in the US. Is just to say that these prices, although they are down considerably, they are still high. And also, if you look at just the current crisis relative to previous price spikes back in 2008, you notice at least deflating by the CPI that in real terms, they weren't quite as high as what we saw in 2008. Price volatility has remained very high. This is volatility is measured by movements within the corn and maize and wheat futures markets. They show very high volatility. I don't have soya up here, but soya would look very, very similar. But that too, by the end of the year, had come down a lot. Volatility had declined and now is more along the lines of more historical levels. Okay, so here, let me just talk about Ukraine. I think the one of the biggest impacts, Ukraine, understand, accounts for about 10% of world wheat exports, also around 15% or so of maize exports, and about 50% of sunflower oil exports. So when the war started, one of the most consequential things that happened was the fact that the Black Sea was cut off from exports. So Ukraine, while they were fighting this war with Russia, also were unable to export through their major ports. And so by consequence, some of the stuff had to go overland, out through Poland, out through Romania, the other way. But most of the shipments were essentially cut off until August. And that's when, through the negotiations through Turkey and with the United Nations, an agreement was reached separately with Russia and Ukraine to allow grain to come out of 3 ports around Odessa. And with that, you can see that since that, about 20 million tons have been shipped since August 1. That's actually been a great relief for getting a lot of Ukraine wheat, maize, and other products out to the rest of the world. Those have largely gone to traditional export markets of Ukraine. So a lot has gone to Europe, a lot has gone to China, a lot has gone to particularly in wheat, a lot has gone to the Mideast and North Africa countries and the African Horn. I show here just the major countries. You can see that most has gone to Europe, a lot going to Spain in terms of feedstuffs for their pork industry, but then a lot also going to China. One thing that has developed in Ukraine over the last several months, however, with the Black Sea grain agreement, is the fact that there is a delay from grain that's shipped out of Ukraine. Under the terms of the agreement, it has to go to Turkey where it's inspected. At that point, there have been delays, and we can see that because of that, there's been gaps between, it's roughly almost 2 million tons of grain has been at times held up because of these inspections. And that Russia sends inspectors as part of the agreement. The criticism is there's not enough inspectors right now to handle the load of grain that's come through. If you look at what it's meant for Ukraine, you can see that prior to the war, they were shipping roughly 5 to 6 million tons a month. That fell right after the war started to less than 2 million tons. And the impact of the Black Sea grain agreement has meant that they've actually been able to recover a lot, but still lagging. And because they're lagging and because of the extra costs incurred by the delays in terms of shipments, that means that the costs of transportation are quite high. Ukraine, of course, is facing world wheat prices, world corn prices, and because of that, those costs then are absorbed by Ukraine farmers. And as we'll see in a moment, what that's translated into is to fewer plantings last fall, and I think as we move into this crop year, there will be less planted there too. Let me just move on through some of these. Let me talk a little just about maize and wheat. We can see that really since about August, those prices have been relatively flat. We've seen a little bit of movement with maize over the last few months. Obviously, a lot of other things going on in the market, but I think that one thing that you can see is that since those peaks at the first part of the year, prices have come down significantly. If we're looking at global ending stocks, I think one of the takeaways is that we're still in a very, very tight situation. Here I'm showing ending stocks expressed as a percent of consumption, or at least in this case, days of use. And I've excluded China largely because China has very large stocks, but they don't make their way to world markets. So as grain analysts, we typically don't consider China. We largely look at stocks held by the major exporting countries. And so this is a proxy for that. And you can see that wheat stocks have declined a lot. They're at the lowest level since 2007-8. That was a period where we had very, very high wheat prices. Maize and soya are also down and at the lowest levels since 2012-13. What happened last year, to the right, you can see that Ukraine ended up exporting a lot less than they had in the previous year. And that's misleading because Ukraine actually had a very large crop coming into 2022. And so they were expected last year to export more than they had in 2021, but instead, because of the war, of some 5 million tons less. Argentina, of course, this reflects the fact that the crop that they're now harvesting is a very poor crop, both in terms of the yields are down, but also the plantings were down because of, again, the third consecutive year of La Nina. And as a consequence, we've seen a lot less wheat. On the other hand, though, Russia had an incredible crop this year. And their exports are up to around 43 million tons, estimated by U.S. Department of Agriculture. Again, about 10.5 million tons greater than the 21-22 season. Canada, too, recovered from a poor crop in 2021. So you can see that, I mean, this is true at any market, obviously. There are regions that are going to balance out those that are hurt. But the takeaway is that there was no significant stock rebuilding. And in fact, stocks fell this year, in part because of the war. Okay, Russia also, as I mentioned, has had very large exports. Given the time, I think I'll skip on to the one thing that we have seen with this war, as we saw during COVID and also during 2007, 2008, and 2010-11 price hikes, is that countries have put on export restrictions. And you can see this year, 2022 is no different. The big ramp up in a number of countries implementing export restrictions and the percent of trade affected by restrictions increased dramatically in March, April, May, and peaked in roughly, at least the percent of trade affected by restrictions peaked in late May. Now, restrictions vary a lot. You can have what we count as export restrictions include things like additional tariffs that countries have put on, or licensing requirements, or outright bans. And the bans, of course, have significant impact. If I look at just two countries, palm oil, for example, in Indonesia, Indonesia accounts for roughly 1/3 of vegetable oil trade. And by putting a ban on palm oil, even though it only lasted 3 weeks before the government relented because of protests from farmers, exports fell significantly. Vegetable oil prices spiked during early May, and since Indonesia took off the ban, vegetable prices have fallen significantly over the last 8 months. Similarly, India put on a ban, but it was a lot less consequential in the sense that they agreed to honor letters of credit, and they also agreed to continue to sell to neighbors like Bangladesh. And in fact, India for the year ended up exporting a lot more wheat than I think a lot of people thought, at least back when India announced a ban in May. I'm going to move quickly to fertilizer. I know you're covering this later. It's just to say fertilizer prices follow very, very closely energy markets, particularly components like urea and ammonia follow natural gas prices. We've had this huge spike in Europe, and because of that, a lot of urea plants and ammonia plants in Europe actually ended up shutting down, and that has driven fertilizer prices considerably. These are unfortunately poor quality graphics taken out of the Amos Market Monitor, but they show that fertilizer prices, even though they're down a lot, remember that they're still very much well above the peaks that we saw in early 2020. So really, in some cases, almost double the price levels. So input prices down a lot, but again, problems that they're still very high. And some of those increases in prices were due to sanctions. I just highlight two here: anhydrous ammonia from Russia. Russia has a large pipeline from plants on the Volga River that go to Odessa. So you can imagine with the war, there's been no anhydrous ammonia being shipped from Russia. On the other hand, we have potash, which again, a major Belarus accounts for about 20% of world potash exports. They've been essentially blocked because of their downing or their diversion of the Ryanair jet even prior to the war in Ukraine. And because of that, they've been unable to ship potash out through the European ports on the Baltic Sea. And so that's had some consequence. I just highlight it for Brazil in particular, that Brazil has had to find potash from other suppliers. For the year, calendar year, Brazil down about 8% in terms of their potash imports. But you can see that the shift has really meant that they've gotten a lot more from Canada. That's true in Indonesia as well. And Russia. Russia has been able to ship out potash. They've been less affected by sanctions, but Belarus really has been affected. Okay, now I'm just going to turn briefly to the outlook. And I think that the important thing to remember is because of these low prices within Ukraine, but because of the high cost of getting grain out of Ukraine and the high input costs that they face, that has really had a detrimental effect on plantings. We didn't see it so much last year because remember the winter wheat crop had already been planted for 2022, and spring plantings, it was remarkable that they were able to get ground planted while the war was going on. But I think this year we will see the impact. So I like to think of this war as already affecting two crops, and now it's likely to have the most significant effect on the 23-24 crop. If you look at beginning stocks as estimated by USDA going into the 23-24 crop year, they're going to be down a bit from last the 22-23 thing, but the main thing will be production. And already we've seen wheat plantings off 35 to 40% for in the fall. I think we're going to see a similar problems in this spring. And again, this isn't assuming anything about the direction of the war, whether or not the war intensifies or not. It's just the fact that prices within Ukraine are very low because of the problems shipping and other factors. If you look at global weather conditions, of course, in the Northern Hemisphere, we're basically talking about dormant. Most of those crops, winter wheats, certainly all being in dormancy right now. This map will be a lot more interesting in 2 or 3 months as we're seeing plantings and then following crop progress. But of course, the big focus in the last few months have been on La Nina and what's going on both in South America, Brazil and Argentina, but also Australia, where we've seen actually record exceptional crops, third year straight of record wheat yields. And so very, very good crop conditions in Australia, offset by a poor crop in Argentina. Hopefully we'll have a big recovery in the soybean crop in Brazil this year, which will help bring down market prices. And certainly if you look at futures market prices, these are just the forward curves. So looking at various futures markets prices looking out over the next 2 years, generally the market feels that prices will start moving down. And I think that certainly would be my view, is that towards the end of this year, assuming normal weather, that we will see a little bit of rebuilding in stocks. But the big uncertainties obviously is what's going to happen to the war itself. And then secondly, whether or not we get that normal weather, because there is almost no margin right now in stock levels. We are down very, very low. Okay, so I think I just summarized everything. Let me stop here and look forward to the Marco's presentation and the discussion that follows.
Thank you so much, Joe. Very good presentation. Sorry for the time restraint. Marcos, your turn now.
Thank you very much, Sergio and Joe. It's a pleasure to be here at the foundation. I think it's very timely to have this discussion about food and energy together. This is extremely important at at that time that we are today. Let me give you some perspectives following this excellent presentation by Joe, but I will talk a little bit about the Brazilian perspectives in these markets, in the food markets. So let me put here my presentation, just a second. The situation is not only the situation of the war, but let's first of all remember that we have several things happening at the same time after 2000. So it's a combination of different events and different impacts together. So it's a complete new situation after 2000, because we never expected that we would have a pandemic, a war, and you see climate change so strong, and inflation and recession. So it's a combination of different events. So it's important to see that the impacts are very strong. The impacts of the war are very strong in trade flows, in commodities like, for example, wheat, corn, oil seeds, and also fertilizers. But we have other big disruptions happening in the world. So the pandemic and the diseases, the pandemic of COVID-19 and diseases like the African swine fever pandemic in China, which was very strong and have changed a lot the way that China is producing pork, and there's impacts on all meats together, a disruption of supply and value chains because of the pandemic and because of the African swine fever situation in China. We have wars. It's not only physical wars like what's happening today in Ukraine, Russia, but we also had impacts from the trade war between US and China. So the impact is more uncertainty, more volatility, and also impacts in some specific commodities, like, for example, grains. We have also climate change happening in several parts of the world, with extreme events in China, in India, not this year, but in last year, for example. Here in Brazil also we had some impacts of, you see, dry seasons and things like that. So this impacts the food system's resilience. We also have had high prices of energy and fertilizers together, with high production costs affecting the margins of the producers and industries. And we had also very high inflation in the world, affecting living costs, food insecurity, affecting healthy diets, and see a very big impact in the world. And also accumulated debts coming from fiscal deficits and cuts in social protection and nutrition programs in the world. So the first point, Sergio, that I'd like to make here is that we cannot only see the war as an event. The war comes together with the pandemic, with climate change, with inflation, and with many other things at the same time in the last 3 years. So the last 3 years were very different of what we had before in the world. The most important insecurities that we have today is a combination of food insecurities, climate insecurities, and energy insecurities together. And it's important to see all these three impacts together, because they are really affecting the markets of food and energy in the world. In terms of the food prices, Joe gave a much better graph here, but just to give you the food index by FAO. So we had an increase of prices in 2008 up to 2012, and then we had this increase in prices after the pandemic and the war. But as Joe made a case, a very good case here, prices are going down now, so they are lower than they were last year, but they are still very high compared to the long series of prices coming from FAO. Here we see the pandemic in terms of nominal prices increasing after the pandemic in 2020, and now we also have the impacts of the war. The impacts of the war were higher, especially in wheat, fertilizers, and corn, you see, because these are the three commodities that were more affected by the war. But all the prices are higher today than they were before the pandemic. So there's a movement of high prices peaking in 2022, and now a little lower than they were last year, as it was pointed by Joe. Another point, a very important point, is to see where we have more food insecurity in the world. So food insecurity is very important, especially in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, in North Africa, in Middle East, and in countries in South and Southeast Asia. So these are the regions that are more affected in terms of risks and in terms of obviously dependence of imports. So it's important to see that the impact of all those events that happened in the last 3 years, they are especially important for countries in Africa and countries in Asia, especially South Asia and also Southeast Asia and Middle East. But the reaction of the exporters was very strong because of the high prices. And this is the point that I would like to make with you about the Brazilian position. So if we look Brazilian exports of agri-food products altogether here, and I'm also considering here the imports of products and inputs like fertilizers, we had a huge increase of Brazilian exports since 2000. In 2000, we exported around $100 billion, and this number was the same in the last in the 7 years before 2000. And then we had an increase from $100 billion to $120 billion, and then to $160 billion of exports from Brazil to the world after the pandemic. So 60% of increase after 2000. And this was because of a combination of high international prices, increasing volumes, because Brazil was a country that has was in a very good position to speed the process of exporting after all those events. So Brazil has today a infrastructure that's much better than it was before. We are now transporting soy and corn by trains in Brazil, and we are able to expand production in Brazil because we are not only increasing productivity, but we are also increasing in horizontal terms into pasture areas, because here in Brazil we have 80 million hectares of agriculture and 160 million hectares of pastures, and a very important part of our exports are coming from the crop livestock systems here in Brazil. So we are expanding agriculture into pasture areas in Brazil. We are expanding around 2 to 3 million hectares per year. So there's a reaction in terms of horizontal expansion and also vertical expansion. So volumes are increasing, international prices are increasing. And we also had here in Brazil a devaluation of the real because of the political situation. So Brazilian prices in reais are much better for the producers. So this was a very important reaction in terms of higher exports from Brazil to the world. But at the same time, we are seeing here higher imports coming from Brazil, coming here to Brazil because of the fertilizers. Fertilizers have been growing a lot here in Brazil. So when we see our major exports, the first one, the leader sector is soybeans. Soybeans is representing 38% of our exports of 160 billion, and soybeans have been growing 12% a year since 2000. So it's a huge increase of Brazilian exports of soy. We also have the high increase of exports in sugar ethanol, and 15% in corn and cotton, 15% per year in the last 22 years here in Brazil of increase for corn, for maize, and for cotton. And why corn and cotton are growing so fast here in Brazil? Because corn and cotton in Brazil are second crops. So they are planted after soy in the same areas without irrigation. So when we produce more soy, at the same time, we are producing much more corn and much more cotton for exports. So this is the big phenomena here in Brazil, is this combination of 2 crops a year, plus the crop livestock integration, which is the expansion of agriculture into pasture areas. So then we have a very, very good result for Brazil in terms of exports. For sure, our exports are very concentrated today in Asia, especially in China and Hong Kong, but also in other countries in Asia, in Middle East. And last year, we also saw increase of exports in Africa. Not very much, but it's growing 10% a year if we look at the whole series since 2000. So today, 66% of our exports are going to Asia, especially to China. And China is by far the #1 country buying our commodities. And one very important thing is that China is not only buying soybeans from Brazil. China is buying more and more corn, for example, because China is changing the way they are producing pork, and they are needing more corn today, and they're open for imports of corn. At the same time, we've been growing our exports of beef and chicken and cellulose and sugar to China, which makes that China today represents $55 billion of exports for Brazil, only China and Hong Kong. So soybean is the #1 product, and China is the #1 destination by far, growing almost 20% per year. Here is a picture of China, and we see here that in 2000, we exported the $1 billion to China, and now we are exporting $52 billion to China. So it's really a very, very strong market for us. It's our #1 destination. And also we are the second supplier of China, just behind the US today. Here is the map of trade balances in the agribusiness sector in the world. So we see very clearly in this map that countries like Brazil, Argentina, Australia, and others are big suppliers. US is also the #1 exporter in terms of commodities, but we have a very big deficit of products, especially in Africa and in Asia. And one thing that's important today is to consider the impacts of geopolitics here. I think this is a new factor for us. So in this war, it was clear the alliance by NATO, but also we are seeing, for example, the return of geography. So the issues related to the former Soviet Union in the Russia-Ukraine war. And we are also seeing different conflicts around China, conflict with the Koreas, conflict with Japan in the South China Sea, in Taiwan, and also with India. So there's an issue today that's very, very, let's say, we can talk about that later, but we see a China-Russia alliance coming down in the road, and the issue of geopolitics around Russia and around China are very important issues for us at this time. In terms of fertilizers, Brazil is the #1 importer of fertilizer in the world. We import 85% of the fertilizers we need. But after the crisis, what we saw is higher prices, but we've been able to find the potash that we need, as it was explained by Joe. So our consumption that used to be 45 million tons of fertilizers, now it's around 41 million tons. And this is because producers are using less fertilizer. They are optimizing the usage of fertilizers. So we have been able to manage the quantities we need, but the prices became very, very high last year, affecting the margins of the producers. We buy basically from Russia, but as you saw, we are also buying more from Canada, from China, from Morocco, and from other countries. So we've been able to diversify our imports from other regions. So we are not importing so much fertilizers as we did in 2021. And we were also able to diversify the supply, looking for other suppliers. So finally, the final slide that I'd like to show you is the increase of the Brazilian share in global exports of soy, corn, and cotton, as I mentioned to you before. So we are seeing here that Brazil today represents more than 50% of the market in soybeans. The US have been reducing soy exports, and this is also because the US is using more soy to produce biofuels and other things. So Brazil is increasing the share and increasing the areas of soybeans and becoming by far the largest exporter of soy. But this year, for the first time, Brazil is also the largest exporter of corn, surpassing the US. The US used to be 60% of the world corn in the market, and today the US is 27% and Brazil is 28%, according to the numbers of the USDA. So for the first time, we are now bigger than the US. This will not continue because the US has a huge potential, but Brazil is now a very important player on the corn markets. And you see here also Ukraine, that's also a very big player. But Ukraine was affected by the war, as it was mentioned by Joe. And finally, in terms of cotton here, we also see a huge increase of Brazil. Brazil is now 20% of the world cotton, surpassing Australia and India and other countries that used to be higher than us. And we believe that in less than 10 years, Brazil will be the first world exporter of cotton. So if we look at these three commodities, soy, corn, and cotton, Brazil has a role here, a very important role. And the last numbers show that even the war and the pandemic, at the end of the day, we've been able to increase production, and we have today a very important role in the global supply of these strategic commodities. So thank you very much, Sergio, and let's go to the debates.
All right. Thank you so much for this comprehensive and enlightening presentation, Marcus. I have a tough task here, which is I'm not an expert on the subject, and I have to put together many elements in a few questions because we are running on a tight schedule. A question for both of you, right? Considering the prices that are being signaled by the future markets, which shows that food prices, the trend is downward, right? So converging to a sort of normalization. How solid is this? What are the downside risks? May the markets be sort of underestimating the risks? Because when I hear your presentation and I see your presentation, Marcos, it's not only the war, and the war can go from bad to worse, right? So first question, would an all-out war on the Ukraine territory affect, to what extent, food prices? First question. And in addition to the war, considering the other factors that are in play, are the markets being too optimistic in signaling a downward trend in food prices in the foreseeable future? What are your take on that matter?
Let me just start real quick. I mean, I think that, the markets are assuming that we're going to have normal weather and that we'll see I mean, I don't think this is going to affect plantings. I think there may be some in the US and other places on crop choice just because input costs are still high. I think the market, if I look at the difference between corn and soybean prices, the market seems to want more corn area, but if last year was any experience, farmers still stuck with soy for the most part, at the margin at least, just because input prices were high and it costs a lot to put on nitrogen on your fields and other sorts of things. And so that makes soybeans a little bit cheaper in that sense. But again, this is all determined. I think because stocks are so tight, all it takes is one drought somewhere in a major producing region like Russia or the EU or North America or South America to send prices right back up. I mean, you remember 2008 to 2012-13, we had 3 different price spikes during that period. And it was largely because we weren't able to rebuild stocks until 2014. And then we saw this period of 5 or 6 years where prices had fallen and everything. But I think that's the real thing. I don't think the market is, I expect if we'll see a lot of volatility, particularly during the spring as planting time comes around, and particularly early summer as crops are developing, because I think the markets will be very focused on yields and yield potential at that point.
Let me, and Marcos, just one more minute with Joe here, just to probe on this comment on stocks. If everything go in the right way, how long will it take for global stocks to return to sort of more safer levels?
Normally for where we are, I think it would take probably 2 years to really get comfortable. I mean, I think, we can see some rebuilding. The problem is we didn't last year, and this year we're starting in the hole. That is, we don't have Ukraine. Ukraine probably won't be supplying 10% of the world wheat exports this year. It'll probably be more like 5 or 7%, somewhere in there. And so these are, I mean, look at Brazil last year. They exported more wheat than they had in previous years. I mean, the farmers react to high prices. And we saw India, India, if you look over the last 10 years prior to 2022 or 21, had exported about 2 to 3 million tons max of wheat. And last year, 2022, they did around 7, almost 8 million tons. So it's farmers will react to high prices, and I think that that's the good news. The bad news is there's just not a lot of room for error right now. I mean, so any sort of weather problem, or frankly, the closing of the Black Sea again to Ukraine exports, and that very well could happen. That the current agreement expires in mid-March. Russia has indicated that it's not happy with the agreement. The war could escalate. All of those, I think, are events I don't even want to contemplate at this point. But it's just to say there's a lot of things that right now that could send prices higher very quickly.
Thank you, Joe. Your turn now, Marcos.
I have exactly the same feeling about what's happening, you see, because we have localized the impacts of the war in products like grains, oil seeds, and fertilizers. And this is just a small part of the agri-food sector, correct? The agri-food is much more important. So we need to see all the other impacts coming from the pandemic, but also and now by climate change. I think we need to really consider that the extreme events are happening everywhere in the world. They're happening in Europe, in US, in Brazil, in Australia, everywhere. So in Canada and many other places. So stocks are very tight. And if we have a problem, because let's also remember, as I showed you here, there are less than 10 countries that are important in all those commodities in terms of exports, because all countries in the world are producing commodities. But exporting commodities in high volumes, it's a task only for a few countries in the world. So if we have a problem in the season of soy or corn in US and Brazil or in Argentina, this affects immediately the markets. So climate change is a big issue today. So this is very important. The other point that I would like to make here is that the demand in Asia is still very strong. Even China growing less than 3% per year, China is still buying a lot of beans, a lot of corn, a lot of sugar, and a lot of products because and now China is recovering. It's coming to 4 and 5% of growth back. So I think that China, Southeast Asia, Middle East, Africa, these regions, they will continue to have a very strong demand. And in some cases, they are not able to produce what they need. So this is a very important opportunity for Brazil, US, Argentina, and other countries that are net food exporters. And finally, Sergio, very important, we needed to have also the right policies in place, because countries are now talking about the wrong policy, for example, taxation of exports. Joe just showed us that 22 countries in the world are today taxing exports or restricting exports, like, for example, Argentina. Argentina is doing a very good job in terms of tax and agriculture. Also, countries are looking for unlimited public stock holdings today. So they are talking at the WTO about having more and more public stocks. They're also talking about distortive subsidies to production and to export. So these are the wrong policies. The right policies in a situation where we have pandemic, war, and climate change problems would be keeping the markets open. First of all, market access is a big issue today. Protecting the most vulnerable consumers, especially in those areas of the world where we have a strong food insecurity. And finally, using non-distortive subsidies. So I think that today, if we go to the WTO today, the WTO is not talking about free markets anymore. They are talking about administered market. So it's very crazy. See, so I believe that global policies are very important, and unfortunately, the global institutions are very weak today. The WTO is weak, and even FAO and others, so they are not able to deal with the problems that we have since 2020.
You've raised your hand, Joe.
Oh, no, I couldn't agree more. I think the chart I loved of Marcos was the one that showed Brazil's evolution over 20 years with China or how China has grown in importance. I just put out a paper where I looked at the 15 top importers currently, or the 15 top exporters to China. And if you look back to 2000, for all of them, China was number 7, number 10, number 15 in terms of important export destinations. And every one right now, China is either the number 1 market or the number 2 market. It's just to say how important China is. I mean, people focus on the phase 1 agreement. In the US, they focus on the phase 1 agreement and say how important that was for the US. China increased imports from every country over that period. So they were importing more from the US, but they were importing more from Brazil. They were importing more from pretty much every country except for Australia, because they had a trade war on with Australia at the time. But yeah, no, these are evolving markets, and I couldn't agree more with Marcos that the important thing is to keep barriers to trade low, to try to eliminate those distortions in the market by agricultural policies. I would add to that, biofuel policies have to be sensible. They have to be realistic. In the time when food prices are high, there needs to be some mechanism to relax mandates, to have off-ramps. You look at Indonesia, they put on a big ban on palm oil in May. It had, as I showed that chart, had incredible consequences. Indonesia, more than half of what's consumed domestically goes into biodiesel production. And that's, at a time when, so the consequence was they put an export ban to keep more of that palm oil home rather than being exported as for food use elsewhere. And so I think we need more sensible policies, and I would put the US at the top of that list. Whereas, as Marcos mentioned, right now almost 45% of soybean oil consumed domestically is going into biodiesel production.
And does that have an impact? Is there a trade-off between in the biodiesel, the food used to produce energy and the food produced to produce food? Right, but there if you use less food to produce energy, would that have an impact on energy prices or not?
No, it's pretty small impact on energy prices,
right.
Just because it's small in that the overall component. It has a much larger impact on food prices. I think that's and I remember that I think we're talking some feedstocks are price competitive, and so you have high energy prices. there are plenty of economic incentives to make fuels out of things like cane sugar or even corn-based ethanol in the US. Right now, those plants operate at positive margins. And I think if you got rid of those mandates, they would petrol manufacturers would still use ethanol because of the octane ratings and other things. That's not true with biodiesel. It's heavily subsidized. It has mandates, all these other factors.
Right. Can we talk now about food security? How worried you are about food security, especially sub-Saharan Africa? Because this has a lot of potential to not only to disturb local politics in these regions, but to trigger large flow of migration towards Europe and other places. Is that a concern? Are tools available to deal with that at the multilateral level? Is this a matter of concern or not?
Yeah, in my opinion, this is a very big concern. But before talking about that, let me just complement that I believe that food and fuels can live together. So it's not food or fuel, but it's food and biofuels, and there's always big opportunities down in the road. Here in Brazil, we are now producing, for example, ethanol of second generation using bagasse, and there's a huge potential for ethanol into hydrogen vehicles. So I think that we should continue this road because we needed to replace fossil fuels by alternative fuels in all areas, including mobility. But we needed to take care, as it was mentioned by Grober, to not expand too much the consumption of, traditional food commodities into biofuels and having a problem like in Indonesia, for example. So coming back to the question about
Food security.
global food security, I believe, Sergio, that the first thing we need to learn is that food security is not a national problem; it's a global problem. So you never solve food security closing the frontiers. We needed to consider trade everywhere. And the big problem today when we talk about, for example, Africa and India and Indonesia, is that those countries are still very close to imports, different of China that have been opening the markets and importing more and more because they have a huge middle class in urban areas. In India, in Indonesia, and in Africa, we still have a lot of protectionism. So this is a big problem to assure food security. And I believe that food security needs, first of all, open markets, but also more investments in technology. So, for example, Joe is part of IFPRI. IFPRI is an organization that's working on global food security issues. And one of the big challenges is to increase productivity in Africa and in Asia in the same way that we did here in the Americas, So, and we needed to really have much more production and much more right incentives in terms of growing productivity, having better market access in internal markets, infrastructure, and things like that.
Your take on that, Joe?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think certainly increasing productivity is very, very important. I think that goes hand in hand with having open markets and other incentives so that countries that are producing more are able to export and able to find markets for their products. But if you look at population growth, you're really talking about sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. That's where we're going to see big increases in population over the next 20 years, 30 years. And unfortunately, those are areas that right now, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, just have very low productivity. So I think the increases in that, and that takes time. I mean, that takes consistent investment in research and development. People talk about repurposing global subsidies. I think that would be a very good use, is to take a lot some of the money that richer countries use to support income or subsidize input use or other sorts of things are used instead in research and development in crops that are germane to those areas that need food the most. And I think that one of the more troubling aspects of the current war, by the way, and getting the focus back to Ukraine and Russia, or Russia in particular, is the fact that Russia is just such a large exporter of fertilizer components, and a lot of sub-Saharan Africa depends very heavily on imports of potash and phosphate and nitrogen-based fertilizer from Russia. And so they have been struggling to get fertilizer, and because prices are, twice that of what they were 2 years ago, or 2 to 3 times that of what it was 2 years ago, that means that the affordability of these products also is quite high. Thus far, I don't think we've seen what the impacts, longer term impacts of that might be on productivity, but again, that is a very big concern.
So your point here is that the high prices for a long period of time, fertilizers, do not bode well to future productivity.
Oh, no,
that's your point, right?
Profitability margins go. I mean, you can get by. If you're a farmer, you can get by a year or so. I mean, even within the US, you see people who bought in fall of 2021 when prices were high, but relatively low relative to what they were in the spring of 2022. I think there were some people this fall who probably put off fertilizer purchases until this spring. That was a good move, but you can't shift that forever. In some cases, you can go a year or so, you still have residuals, fertilizer in the ground and everything. But over the long run, you can't just, people need to come up with to make those purchases or find alternative organic green fertilizers, that sort of thing. And that's going to take time. I think that's where some research and development could go into, but what the world doesn't need is productivity losses in those areas that are the poorest, like sub-Saharan Africa.
And that one more question here, and that's it. Go ahead, Marcos. Go ahead.
No, just to emphasize that global, Joe is very correct, because we had a very important increase of prices of commodities, but the inputs also were very strong. Not only fertilizers, but also machinery, pesticides, and energy. So if we put all together, the margins of the producers were good, but they have been affected by those inputs. So it's very important to see what will happen, especially to Africa and to South Asia, because these are the regions that in the future will have more and more population, but they still keep very high rates of people living in rural areas, which is a big challenge for the world. The big challenge of the century will be how to feed Africa and South Asia.
Yeah, I agree. And one last point, Sergio. Here, my whole presentation was essentially on grains and oil seeds, or in particular wheat and corn. Rice is one commodity that we haven't seen much in terms of prices. They've had ample supplies, but stocks have tightened there as well. And rice is very fertilizer intensive. And so the concern has been with, long periods of very high fertilizer prices, will that mean less fertilizer use in places like South Asia, which I think really could be a problem. We've seen Thai rice prices up about 20% over the last 2 months. So those are things that certainly we're following at this point.
Very interesting. Joe, allow us to focus a little bit in this final minutes on Brazil. Is that okay for you?
Sure.
All right. Marcos, a couple of things. Weather permitting, is Brazil clearly a big winner in this story as far as we can see? And this is the general question. The more specific one is, you've mentioned that we have witnessed new technologies like the rotation, the two crop, and so on and so forth. But you also mentioned that infrastructure now is much better than it was in the past. How so?
Yeah, Sergio, I think that we had several revolutions here in Brazil since the 70s. First, with the seeds and the genetics that allowed us to plant soy today in Maranhão or in Piauí, even in Ceará. So soybean has been expanding in the direction of the equator. And then we have no-till techniques, and then we had the second cropping coming on the 90s, which is a huge phenomenon because all producers are moving to second crop if they can. We are also increasing irrigation here in Brazil, and the big movement of this decade that we are living today is in one side of the crop livestock integration, which is growing 2 million hectares per year. So areas that used to be pastures, they are becoming today agriculture integrated with pastures, because we can, for example, produce soy, corn, and pastures in the same season. For soy, and then we plant corn during the rains, and then after the rains we can also keep cattle in the same area. So this is a huge revolution. So producing much more in the same areas. So in my opinion, the big phenomenon of this decade will be in agriculture, crop livestock integration in Brazil. And the second revolution will be infrastructure, moving from trucks and long roads as we had in the past to trains and waterways. So today, for example, the number one state here, agricultural state here in Brazil is Mato Grosso. And Mato Grosso can ship grains to the northern arch, so to the ports of Pará through BR-163, but can also ship more and more grains using the north-south railway, and now the new expansion of Ferronorte from Rondonópolis to Lucas do Rio Verde. So we are going to see a complete change in our infrastructure, moving finally from trucks to trains, roads, and also ports that are much better today than they were before. I think we had the right regulations here in Brazil, and we finally have a situation that comes very close to US, Canada, Australia, and other countries that used to have trained a long time ago. And we are having very strong investments there. And we are seeing that the prices of freights in dollar per ton are very similar today from Mato Grosso to Santos compared to the same distance in the US, for example. So these kind of things, people are not talking here in Brazil, but it's happening.
Yeah,
you see,
that's why I'm calling attention to it.
Really participating in this.
It goes under the radar screen here, but I think things are moving in the right direction in this area. This is your point. All right, we come to the end of it, Joe and Marcos. It was a tall order for me to moderate this panel. You're really experts on the subject. I'm not. It was a crash course on global food markets for me. I thank you for that, and I hope we can see each other again soon and hold more of this interesting conversation. Thank you so much for making the time. Hope to see you guys again. If you want to stay and watch the other panel, you're more than welcome.
Very good. Well, welcome back, everybody, to the second panel of today's event. My name is Jacob Kierkegaard, and I'm a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, as well as the Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C. And we have just visited the murky corners of the global food commodity markets. But now it's going to get really murky, because this panel is really about energy, which is not only the principal driver, of course, of global inflation and a whole bunch of other ills, but you hardly need to read Daniel Yergin's book to know that the global energy markets have their tentacles, if you can use that word, into politics and pretty much everything else of importance around the world. And we're particularly fortunate today to be joined by really two of the foremost energy experts in the world to discuss these issues. First, we have Clarissa Linz, who is, among many things, a senior fellow at SIBRI, but she's also a has a long career in Petrobras. She's a board of directors, executive director at the Brazilian Petroleum Institute, and quite frankly, too numerous a list of accomplishments to list here in the interest of time. But you can spell her name and you can look her up on Google if you are thus interested. Secondly, we have Elena Rybakova, whom I am happy to say currently joins us. I know this from no place else but the Peterson Institute in Washington, D.C. I know these bookshelves very well. But more importantly, Elena is also the deputy chief economist of the Institute for International Finance, which is another, I guess I can say, think tank in Washington, D.C. And she has a very long and illustrious career in financial markets, as well as spending the better part, in fact, almost a decade at the IMF in Washington, D.C. And currently, I think it's fair to say that Elena is one of the foremost experts in the world of not only what has happened in European energy markets recently, but everything related to G7 oil sanctions, etc., which are, of course, also an integral part right now, or in fact have been for many years, the global commodity markets. But I thought, in the interest of sort of trying to structure this a little bit, we should start with probably the market, or the two markets that have had the most upheaval in recent years related to the war in Ukraine. That is, of course, the natural gas markets, pipeline, LNG, and then global oil markets. So maybe I should start, since I am in Brussels, where we care more about natural gas than oil. So maybe we can start with really global LNG. And I don't know who wants to start, Clarissa or Elena, but one of the striking things to me have really been the sort of ability of the European economies to wean themselves off pipeline gas from Europe, and by tapping into global LNG markets. Is this sustainable? Has it happened at the expense, if you like, of poorer countries' access to these markets? What happens when China reopens? And is this really good for global decarbonization? So maybe I can start with you, Elena.
Thank you so much. I think it's important to remind also, particularly for the European market, that Russia is still an important exporter of LNG. So, of course, the incredible setup of infrastructure that Germany and some other countries have done over the last year, which we never thought possible, the construction of these facilities in such a speed, and also more facilities coming out online in 2024. But nonetheless, if you look at the statistics, a big pickup of imports of LNG also comes from Russia. And, it's not only Novatek, it's also other Russian oil majors have exported LNG in the past. It's a joint venture product, of course, with some of the European companies. It's not under sanctions at the moment, and it has long-term contracts, which means much lower prices than the spot prices, which we saw on gas last year. So in a way, it makes sense. It was a rational decision. Nonetheless, going forward, it's likely that Europe would like to continue weaning itself off from Russian energy dependency altogether. So therefore, on one hand, we have this good news. On the other hand, Russia is the one actually supplying LNG to Europe, is exactly the country we're trying to diversify away from. We also know some other countries, and I'm sure Clarissa will talk more about that, is, Japan, South Korea. They also are importing some of the Russian LNG. And we also have seen Japan sort of being very cautious on the oil and gas measures that other countries proposing or sort of already have taken. So Japan aligns itself with a lot of the multinational measures against Russia, but not specifically on the oil and gas. So going forward, as we see recovery in China, the sudden no COVID policy, zero COVID policy, as we see the recovery there, it might put pressure. And there are especially countries in Asia that might try to bid away from Europe, the scarce LNG supply on the global market.
So thank you very much, Jacob, for your very kind introduction. And please, allow me just to make a slight adjustment. I'm not senior fellow at SEBRI anymore. I'm now board of board of trustees. I'm a member of the board of trustees, but it was a very smooth transition, I would say. But thank you very much, and my pleasure to be here with you, Jacob and Elena. So maybe before jumping into the LNG market, I'd like to just recap what has happened over the last year and a half. So the world has been hit by a war, but it's an energy war, first of all. It's a European war, second. So we had, big shakeups both in the European continent, but I would say that going beyond Europe, of course, affecting massively the energy markets. The natural gas was, I would say, the first commodity to be hardly hit, with a shortage of supply, immediate impact on prices, whether they were, short-term, long-term perspective, but really the European continent, but also the world, had to keep a very close eye on how to live without the Russian gas on a long-standing approach, I would say, supply approach. So I would say that this is, the context that I'd like to really remind us all, because it helped us to set the stage. At the same time, as Elena mentioned, the European Union was really agile in reacting with short-term, but also preparing for a different mid to long-term approach when it comes to dependency on the Russian gas. And basically, the measures were, I would say, very well succeeded, because, as mentioned by Elena, building LNG terminals and being able to supply gas without having, relying on access through a Russian pipeline was something that the world didn't really believe it was possible within the time frame that it happened. So I would say less than 10 months, right, Lena, between the decision-making process and making it happen. So with that, there's a shakeup. So Russian, who used to provide gas to the European market using basically 92% of the supply coming through pipelines, will have to reinvent itself, while the European country is really preparing to decarbonize its power mix with, I would say, a very successful strategy when it comes to both diversifying gas supply out of Russian dependence, but also, I would say, doubling the approach towards renewable, especially for power generation. So all in all, what to expect from now on, as mentioned by Elena, really great uncertainty if we look to the forthcoming demand from China. So will it resume at a high speed? Will it resume in a way that really tighten the supply of natural gas to the other markets? How will the winter really goes on? We have been lucky enough in Europe to have a mild winter. Will that remain? What about next winter? So with that, all the storage capacity has been able to resume, but what about the next winters? One of the CEO of the largest oil and gas major company made that alert, really showcasing the fact that we'll have to really be concerned not only about the 2023 consequences, but looking forward to the 2024 and 2025, so on. So all in all, I would say that the lesson learned is that increased volatility could remain, because China is going to stress the markets. But when you think in terms in mid and long term diversification and in the direction of decarbonization of our sources of supply of energy and power, more specifically, is the right one to do.
Well, thank you very much for those, I think, very exhaustive answers to what is really a very complex issue. I'd like to now probably shift to another and arguably even more important market, namely oil markets. Obviously, oil is a commodity that has a long checkered history. We're intertwined with politics and wars and a lot of other things. And one of the outcomes of the war in Ukraine is obviously that while we have had major oil exporters in Iran, Venezuela, and elsewhere, unilaterally sanctioned, sometimes by other countries as well, but certainly unilaterally by the United States for a number of years. You now also have a particular type of oil sanctions levied on one of the largest producers in the world, namely Russia. Obviously, the EU, the US, and other Western countries have banned the imports of all Russian or most Russian oil. But the G7 have also put this, I guess, increasingly infamous price cap on Russian sales of oil to third countries. And then we have heard, reading in the press about the buildup of shadow fleets of Russian tankers and how Russia may be selling the oil cheaper, but then making up the money by supplying the insurance and the financing, etc. So really my question to both of you will be, are these sanctions against Russian oil exports working? If so, why? And if not, why not? I don't know who would. Elena?
Maybe I start, and I will say that, look, sanctions are not like flipping a switch or pressing a button and then hop, and Russia sort of implodes. Unfortunately, especially in the oil markets, it doesn't happen. It's a very, as you know very well, complex and increasingly intransparent market. So what we see now, first of all, the sanctions, the measures did not take place until December. So last year, Russia's current account surplus is more than 220 billion. This is more than double any historical record. And why? Mostly because oil exports have increased. So they've increased in terms of volume in some cases and in terms of price in other cases. Imports contracted about 16% or maybe 19% last year. So they made a contribution, but overwhelmingly the contribution came from this high oil exports. Another important point, and we're just about to publish a paper on that, hopefully this week, we have the unique data set of more than 50 million different transactions, including on oil and gas exports from Russia. And we do not see the discounts. So the discounts that everybody talks about, the $30, sale price of 50, we do see in many cases, especially for China, the price going at between $70 and $80. And this is the FOB price, which means supposedly China is also paying for the delivery, sort of shipment and transportation. So this is potentially even higher price than what we estimate in our paper. We do see the discounts to India partially, but that's still not a big part of the market from Russia. So the bottom line here is oil is very fungible. It is becoming to be more fragmented and intransparent market. So for us to be successful in implementation, we need to be sort of a few steps ahead on the enforcement and implementation.
So if I might, just to give slightly different flavor on what Elena has just said, I would say that maybe just a quick reminder of what's the objective of the sanctions. So it's try to impose a cost on Russia without, I would say, causing major disruption in the global oil market. So and this is very difficult. It's very tricky, and I wouldn't, like to be a policymaker having to decide whether to impose the sanction with a price cap. So I understand that the price cap was really somehow try to limit Russian, surplus, because last year Russia was able to benefit from the higher prices. So it was kind of, establishing sanctions, but at the same time limiting the revenues that Russia would have out of oil and oil products. So somehow this was, I would say, this is being successful in letting the flow of oil and oil products really reach different markets without causing a major disruption. So I understand that from this perspective, it's been, I would say, successful. Of course, we've been observing, as mentioned by Elena, that China and India reacted immediately, not abiding by not supporting the sanction, and then turning to be nowadays the largest buyers of Russian oil and oil products. Just for you to have an idea, export volumes to India topped more than 1 billion barrels per day in December last year. And Russia has already, as of we speak, became China's largest supplier of crude oil, surpassing Saudi Arabia. So it's a new geopolitical arrangement. While EU, G7, and I would say the Western countries are really trying to limit Russia's revenues out of this market. The Russian government reacted very recently by saying that it will limit its short-term production by 500,000 of barrels per day, which could have an impact again on global prices. But what I suggest is that we also have a mid to long-term, perspective on that. And at the end of the day, Russia will lose this energy battle by really losing market share in the global oil market. And this is, what's striking the energy analysts say, but are they really realizing that they will lose the gas market to Europe and that they are about to lose, the oil market to other suppliers when it comes, of course, to the global flows, not looking to China's and India's one. So that's the big question mark, because Russia will have a limited market share and geopolitical influence in the midterm through its diminished influence in the oil and gas market.
Thank you. Before we go, I also want to spend quite a bit of time talking about the sort of decarbonization, et cetera, but we have a question from Rafael Almeida in the Q&A. It's quite a political question. So now that we've just talking about oil, it's probably the right time to take it. He says that essentially, obviously China has to some extent sided with Russia in the war. And the question is whether or not, and I think it's fair to say, we recently saw, obviously, President Lula had some, I think it's quite fair to say, some fairly choice words when German Chancellor Scholz asked him about Brazil's position in the war. And basically the question here is there, sort of geopolitical splits coming from this war between the BRICS, among the BRICS? It's well known, obviously, that the Western world, the OECD members, have largely and are largely in support, are supporting Ukraine, but several BRICS members are not. And we've just heard how the largest member of the BRICS, while maybe not explicitly supporting Russia, are certainly, exploiting the fact that they can get cheap oil and gas from Russia. So are we seeing, because of these also these geopolitical impacts of energy markets, a new set of really geopolitical splits among the world's largest economies and countries?
We're definitely seeing that. And as Clarissa was pointing out, is we have complete sort of structural shift in the way that Russia trades energy, for example, right? If it used to be the biggest market, Europe, for Russian energy, particular oil, now by far the biggest market is China and India. And this is where we talk about the fragmentation of the market. And Russia is definitely losing influence in the countries that are against the war, Russia's war in Ukraine. But it's very important that Russia doesn't gain that influence in other markets by sort of eventually providing cheaper discounts to India and also having the long-term relationship with China. So I think that's something that we need to be very mindful, because for some of the countries, whether it's India, because it's a very historic, deep relationship with Russia. And if we go look back during the Soviet times, there was the cultural exchanges, there was strong belief among the Indian authorities that Russia sort of supported them in the anti-imperialistic move, especially during the independence, and there's still deep cultural ties left there. And of course, for China, that is at the moment extremely wary of the sentiment in Washington, D.C., where I sit now, of this long-term strategic geopolitical confrontation. It might be looking more informally, less announced on the front pages of their newspapers and FT especially, but more informal cooperation with Russia. If you look at the trade between China and Russia at the moment, China is now by far the largest trade partner, and China and Hong Kong, the countries that increased trade with Russia the most over the last year. If you look a little bit deeper, China is the one that is providing chips and other critical technology to Russian consumer and military potentially. So one thing, China says sort of the talk, and another thing is what actually China is doing is the walk. So I think that there is a big risk of that sort of geopolitical fragmentation. And I will stop there. We can continue more.
I think that Elena has a very good perspective on this new momentum, I would say, of geopolitical fragmentation. What we've been observing here in Brazil since Lula took over is really a kind of a coming back to the importance and influence of the BRICS, in the sense that they could have a new role, a more neutral approach towards global climate issues, and specifically towards the war. I would say that this is not a consensus among the Brazilians, but it seems to be a clear priority of Lula's government, really, to be able to influence towards the peace without, taking a formal position supporting Ukraine or Russia or going against Russia. So in this sense, maybe Lula wants, to come back to the old days where he was able to gather the BRICS sentiment towards a differentiated role of the southern countries, and maybe a different approach towards influencing the end of the war. I think that last week's visit to President Biden was a very symbolic and important one when it comes to global issues such as climate change and even the war, but also to a place to be held by Brazil at the UN Security Defense Council.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, well, you've already broached the issue of climate change, which is, of course, arguably, some talk about the war in Ukraine as a hurricane, but then climate change is really the tide. It's really this long-term structural shift that inevitably, of course, also affects global energy markets. Certainly looking at that issue, the connection between the two, from Europe, it's very clear that this war has had or will have a galvanizing and indeed very strongly accelerating effect on Europe's entire decarbonization drive. Getting out of Russian fossil fuels to get out of all fossil fuels is very clearly the mantra adopted by a number of European leaders. And obviously, it coincides in time with the adoption of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, which is the first large-scale federal government subsidy of the greening of American industry. Which is certainly, in my opinion, will lead to a significant acceleration of decarbonization also in the United States. And meanwhile, of course, China is beating both Europe and the United States in terms of investments in solar and wind energy. So it really does seem as if we, have reached some sort of, I wouldn't say threshold or the point at which politics and technology levels coincide to make decarbonization, far more self-sustaining and no longer reliant on, various degrees of public support. And I guess if that's true, that would be my first question. Do you share that view? And secondly, if that is true, you would imagine the implications on fossil fuel markets, not least the oil market. Because then I would contend that it becomes ever clearer that much of the oil that we know we have is going to be worthless. It will never be pulled out of the ground. So you're going to have this race among oil producers to not have their oil, quote unquote, be left in the ground, which presumably would have some implications for the higher cost producers around the world first. So I would like to ask you whether you share that analysis or for other relevant perspectives in this area. And I think maybe you, Clarissa, can start this time.
Yeah, can I start? Yeah. So thank you for the question, Jacob, because I think that this is, the hot topic right now at the moment, both in the US and Europe and in other countries such as Brazil. So there is no doubt that the IRA represents, when you look to the decarbonization context, a once-in-a-life chance, to really upscale investments, technologies, deploy technologies at scale, at competitive prices, through incentive measures, and not through a more European approach oriented towards a stick and carrots. So from the corporate perspective, is really the place where you want to be. I want to have access to tax credits. I want to be able to innovate, to deploy new technologies, and really to reap all the benefits out of the new development technologies that will reindustrialize the US and maybe part of the world through green technologies. So it's a step change public policy. It is having strong consequences on the way the European Union understands and realizes to what extent should European public policies also change in order to keep the level of industrial competitiveness that is needed in a low carbon world. So this is what is at stake. The US, argue that their policies will have spillover effects throughout the value chains of these green technologies, and the world will benefit at the end of the day from their incentives. It remains to be seen, because there's a clear local content added to these policies. Mexico and Canada will, because they are trade partners, immediately benefit also from this. But other countries such as Brazil, South Africa, and even the European will still not know. So this is, I would say, the first part of my answer to your question. The second part, which has to do with what about oil? Then it's a very, I would say, a tricky approach, because we know that at the end game, the world will have to decarbonize and will have to count on new technologies, but also on removal technologies, so on lower carbon intensive technologies, plus carbon removal coming from nature solutions and from technological ones. It depends whether you're located, but we'll still have to rely on oil for a couple of years. And this is the difficult conversation that we're having among us as a global society, because we still rely heavily on oil and gas. 80% of our energy matrix still rely on oil, gas, and coal. But we know that we cannot support and handle the emissions out of the combustion of oil because they are leading to extreme weather events and so forth, so forth. So how to reconcile those two worlds? This is, I would say, the question to be answered. And how will we transition? Will it be orderly so we can avoid, price spikes? And how really to incentivize companies to invest in a way that shareholders are still confident that they will have their returns, that R&D will remain, that tax payments will have, that the employments will be generated, and at the end of the day, that will be able to secure our energy. I don't know what the answer is. what I do know is that we will still rely on oil, but we have to decarbonize our energy system. And we'll, the best way to do is to do it orderly. At what, time speed, the faster the sooner. But, taking into consideration that different countries stand on different positions and that technologies and financial resources should be able to all the competitive ones, not through protectionism, but through competitive incentives. So it's not very clear, but because I would say that energy security is at the table with an extra importance after the Russian invasion of Ukraine.
Alina?
Thank you. I'm very glad that Clarissa went first, because the coexistence of the old and new world will have to last for a long time. We somehow seem to think, maybe in historical books, there is a discontinuity, but you're missing like 100 years in the middle, right? So I think we're going to be in that period of still the traditional oil and gas industry, and then the disruptors that are trying to move on with the renewables. And the issue is that a lot of the companies that are sort of the startups, or maybe companies trying to find new creative ways, many of them also do not have enough experience with the existing oil industry to truly be helpful. So you almost have this sort of the coexistence of very different sort of camps, where the disruptors do not actually know what are they exactly supposed to disrupt. They're trying to come up with new creative solutions without fully understanding how it works at the moment. And on the topic of the energy security, I think it's been critical for Europe last year, when we realized we cannot have too many objectives with very few tools. So there was extraordinary inflation, there was national security threat. We're trying to move towards a green agenda. At the same time, we need to diversify from Russia. Meeting all of those objectives at the same time was just, fiscal and monetary policy in the short term, this just was not possible. So therefore, we're trying to come back in Europe to, maybe some renewables, maybe reconsidering in some countries of nuclear, of course, building the new terminals, and also potentially going back to the old gas partners to whom we said that, look, we want to disconnect from you. 10 years from now, we're not going to buy from you. Of course, some of these gas partners turned around and said to Europe that, okay, here we go, expensive spot prices, and we're going to make friends with China. So now we need to go back to some of even traditional players still, because we need them. We need to combine this sort of two different worlds, the old energy market and the new market, and at the same time think about the energy security, which is still a noble concept for many.
Well, I think that's a very, both of you got to this, the coexistence of the old and the new world. It's obviously, to some extent we're already here, but I guess I would like to push you a little bit on the duration of that coexistence, because if I take, if I put on my sort of techno-optimistic glasses, and I look at initiatives like California, the European Union, and elsewhere, banning the sale of internal combustion engine cars by 2035. The fact that electric vehicles, even today, have lower lifetime ownership costs than traditional cars. That suggests to me that certainly in the transportation sector, this could go very quickly, and I guess I would also submit that the ability of Europe to shift gas suppliers very rapidly, entailing with a 20% decline in overall roughly natural gas demand, suggests that energy, even that sector, is more flexible, and we are heavily towards electrification. I guess I would say it may not be that long, at least in the advanced economies. And then the real question is, how quickly will new electrified technologies be diffused globally? But that is more of, unfortunately, I guess, a sort of a geographic coexistence of a new and old economy than a mixed one in advanced economies. I don't know how you would respond to that.
Can I start?
Yeah.
This is my favorite topic. So
Okay, please take it away.
Yeah. Now, so Jacob, I would like to call your attention to long-term, perspective when it comes to energy. In all the scenarios that are available to us, if you look to the Shells and BPs, if you look to the International Energy Agency scenarios, to the IRENA one, in all these scenarios, oil and gas are still part, and in some more relevant part of the energy mix than in others. So I would say that the trend is there. So we all know that we'll have to diminish our dependence on fossil fuel sources. This is given. So at what speed? This is the question. With what technologies? This is the other question. At what cost? For whom? And those are two very relevant questions as well. And the fifth question I would add to that is that we don't want to, keep our highly dependence on a few suppliers of oil and gas, as we also don't want to replace this dependency with another one coming from critical minerals that are largely dominated by China nowadays. So having all those, questions to be answered, it's with only a few public policies instruments, it's obvious that there was no one-size-fits-all solution, and that every region, every society will have to define the cost, the speed, and the frame of its energy solution going forward. In all of them, we'll find, room to diminish the dependence on oil and gas. The speed, again, at which the dependency will diminish is to be defined by the cost the society and by the opportunities, of course, the society will want to have. So if you look to Brazil, for instance, our largest problems when it comes to emissions rely on curbing down our deforestation rates that are largely the reason for our global greenhouse gas emission. So we'll have to tackle, illegal deforestation first, while strengthening the diversity of our energy sources. And when it comes to transportation, of course, electrification to some extent is one possibility, but at what cost? And then is it the only possibility? Maybe not. We have, other biofuels, advanced biofuels possibilities, and so forth. So really, I would say the beauty of the energy context is that it is diverse, and that each region will have to find, considering and of course respecting its competitive advantages, because this makes the solution more cost efficient to society, but we'll have to define its own. We'll love, as a developing economy, to count on, transfer of technologies for green hydrogen, for instance. I would love, because I am already very competitive when it comes to renewable energy, to count on, what is called blend finance to really boost green energy production in Brazil. And that's why I love when I see, developed economies wanting to deploy those low carbon technologies at speed, at scale. But I would also love to have them investing in Brazil and allowing developing economies to be part of this global development as well.
I will just add, following on the cost conversation, is we look at the last year, it's oil and gas companies that make extraordinary profits, given the situation last year. And unfortunately or fortunately, we still need them. So every government, oftentimes in the US recently, comes up and says, look, we have this target. We're going to get rid of oil and gas within X number of years. And I think that doesn't take into account realistic accounting of the cost and benefits. If we do it tomorrow, there will be huge costs to the society, which actually nobody spells out to the society we cannot afford. If we want to do it over time, we need to work with the oil and gas industry, within that industry, to become more green, more sustainable, and more cleaner, and then there is still much more room to be done there. And then at the same time, gradually moving away to this sort of new disruptors and new technologies. So I think that's something that is extremely important, explaining the cost accounting to the society and not giving this completely unrealistic targets. Somehow it's not okay to say something on the economics because people are beginning to figure it out, but it's perfectly fine to say, oh, we're going to get rid of oil and gas by year something. So I think that's the first one. And the second one, the distribution of costs between what we used to call developed and emerging markets. It shouldn't be just transfer costs. What it means to be green in South Africa at this stage of the economic development is very different what it means for European Union and the US. And we cannot possibly apply the same standards, especially if some of these countries can say, wait a second, you've done the worst contribution to the climate change. So why are we supposed to pay right now here? So I think there has to be the costs and benefits. There has to be acknowledgement of the costs on one hand, and the other has, as Clarissa said, the transfer of the technology that in theory should be a benefit. So I think we need to live with the reality we're not going to be able to move all together. It is costly. It is particularly costly for a lot of emerging markets, and we'll just have to stagger that implementation.
Well, thank you, Lina. Actually, one question that I'd like to pick up on is on this cost of the transition. Now, we've all talked about getting out of fossil fuel in general, but there's obviously one fossil fuel that certainly, if you look at the COP process, that there's been an awful lot of focus on really getting out of it very quickly, and that is coal. Now, unfortunately, of course, that is also the fuel that is readily available in many, especially emerging markets, India and elsewhere, which makes it a very economically attractive fuel to utilize. And then, of course, we have this price shock to the global LNG market, where suddenly a rich part of the world, namely Europe, goes in and buys pretty much everything that's available, pricing out a lot of emerging markets from this alternative to coal. So I guess I would, like to ask you, what do you think, given those recent developments, what is the best way? I mean, absent, of course, a global carbon price and other pie in the sky options, what is the best way to accelerate the exit from coal?
So Jacob, I would say that the best way is really to have competitive alternative sources of energy. so this is the short answer coming from an economist by background. So we'll have to have competitive products in order to replace this one. But having said that, and this is already the case when you look, I would say, globally to the prices of renewable energy nowadays, solar and wind, could be competitive in many geographies, including India, for instance. So, and then maybe you can, work hand in hand with the legacy industry, which you have, assets that are based on the use of coal, but you have the new ones. And India is a very good example because India is supposed to be, the fastest growth market in the world, supposedly. A whole new set of investments to rebuild or to build infrastructure, new industries, etc., that could be based on renewable power. And as far as I know, that's already the direction the Indian government is adopting. So a kind of incentivizing greenfield investments, really industrial ones, for instance, relying on green energy. So while at the same time you have the legacy, you have what it's in place, but when you look to the future, it's going to be on a different base approach. So I would say that this would be, of course, for the emerging economies, something that would make sense, because you cannot, as Elena mentioned, you cannot, put unrealistic targets and think that you will leave people without access to energy, because it's unsustainable from a social perspective. And as you know, all of us live in the basis of having access to energy, whether power or energy. So it's unthinkable to propose that some countries would kill their coal industry immediately unless there isn't anything affordable and secure enough to replace. And the good news is that in many countries, you have affordable and renewable energy in place that could be used to replace coal.
Well, I can't resist saying that Germany has killed its nuclear industry long before it's killed its coal industry, just to emphasize what you just said. But Elena, I don't know if you have any comments.
I will just add that, we talk a lot about deglobalization, right? And we imagine it somehow this scary monster that has come out and has eaten up all our trade and other linkages. But I think the way we should probably think about it is sort of a world of clubs or issue-specific tactical alliances. And I think the war in Ukraine sort of highlighted that. So if we talk, for example, about US-China, we have hardly find any points of contacts anymore. So if, in Washington, D.C., if you want to write a paper on the China-US confrontation, you have plenty of talking points. If anybody sort of raises a hand, and what is the connection? What is any sort of constructive cooperation? Nobody can come up with a topic. And the green transformation, renewables might be that small strategic tactical topic, not going for this endless end of the sort of certain year objectives, but on issue specific where they can still be cooperation. That might be the place where we can keep bits and pieces of the sort of post-globalized world on a very tactical specific agreements, whether it's technology exchange in exchange for something else, on an issue specific that is considered important for anybody, but with the compromises that work for both sides. So that's how I see the sort of the discussion on green and reduction, whether it's nuclear or coal, because as you mentioned yourself, Jacob, it's very different for each country.
Thank you. Actually, yeah, you just mentioned, I guess, the last major energy sector that we haven't touched upon, which is nuclear, of course. And now, certainly when I look at nuclear, it's typically associated with these massive CapEx investment, billions of dollars, even more billions of dollars in cost overruns and delays and things like that. So for me, any time of nuclear is inevitably linked to financing. And I guess my question there is, one, what do you think the role for nuclear should be globally? There's clearly a revival going on in the United States and Europe. China never slowed down. But what about the rest of the world? There's clearly also an issue about dependency to the Russian nuclear industry. But then, perhaps we can also, as we go towards the end, talk a little bit more about this issue of financing. I mean, you, Clarissa, mentioned it several times about the financing of the green transition. What are the vehicles? Everyone, of course, knows that there is one of the most contentious issues in the COP negotiations is the transition fund, the $100 billion a year that the advanced economies have promised emerging markets to accelerate this transition. Somehow, not all of the money shows up. So how do we finance this transition at the global scale, with or without nuclear, really? Maybe Elena, you can start. Oh, sorry, Clarissa, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, Elena, please go.
I will be more sort of surgical, and so I'll start with that. So I think on nuclear, and Jacob, thank you for mentioning it already. We forget that Russia has a strong leadership in terms of projecting power and financing. Of course, the Russian financing will be drying up more because it's much more engaged sort of in spending on the war and will need to finance its own budgets. But until recently, Russia is technologically among the leaders still, we don't want to acknowledge always that, but we have to, in nuclear, and also could provide the financing for some of the projects we have seen in Middle East and Africa and others. So they do oftentimes in the past have come up in tenders, whether it's with the US or French or other companies, and they had the state backing in order to be able to do that. Of course, with sanctions, we might be able to curb that more, but I don't think there's enough attention being put to that, because as you say, once the financing happened, the project is in place, it's very hard then for a country to disentangle itself from Russia, because it's such an important project. And then the last one, the other comment I want to make is that even within Europe, there can be more different between France and Germany. So, you know, it's hard to talk about the global 100 billion, even if within neighbors, there's absolutely sort of, polarized opinions on nuclear. I'll stop here.
Yeah. Thank you, Elena. What I would add, Jacob, is first of all, there is a revival when it comes to nuclear energy, and the revival, I understand, is due to the role of nuclear as an additional low carbon source. It's a clean source of energy. So of course, when you think in terms of energy security, nuclear is, you know, a must-have energy source in whenever you can. And of course, whenever you can has to do with costs, with access to technology, but also has to do with the dialogue that governments should have with their society with regard to nuclear waste. So it's not only an energy, I would say, a choice, it's also a societal choice. And of course, one that has to be considered within the context of affordable energies. So it's maybe more complex than all the sources, but France is there to show us, to showcase that nuclear could have a very important role when it comes to energy, clean security source. So having said that, I also have the perception that all, you know, future trends are including nuclear source in their scenarios. But also I'm happy to acknowledge that there has been some technology advancement when it comes, for instance, to small nuclear reactors development. So although they have not been commercially proven yet, there's a lot of investment in there. And a recent statistic that I was aware of was stating that until 2030, we would certainly be able to really have in place some commercially viable small nuclear reactors. So with that, again, I think that the diversity is part of the equation that we want to have. In the specific case of nuclear, it has to be combined with, I would say, a very thoughtful engagement with local societies. When it comes to finance, I think that it's very good in a sense that the focus on the 100 billion has been, you know, given at the last COP, because it's not only about the 100 billion, it's all about the ways that the world, the financial world, needs to find out really to make the flows of resources, of financial resources available to reach project developers here in Brazil, again, in South Africa, in India, in Nigeria, in other places where the cost of money is higher. And I will not go to debate the interest rate in Brazil because it's a very hot topic, but the cost of money is higher. There is less, I would say, environmental, maybe regulatory clarity and robustness. So, and that's why maybe the cost of doing business is also higher. So we have to deal with those issues. And apparently there's a role for multinational entities such as World Bank, IMF, etc., really to put in place some financial mechanisms that would allow the financial investments to invest comfortably in developing and emerging economies. So it has to be done and deployed differently from the business as usual.
Well, actually, on the issue of financing, there is a question on the Q&A that goes specifically about the potential role. I mean, you mentioned World Bank and other international financial institutions, but the question here specifically goes to a potential role for the BRICS Bank. I suppose, in general, financing energy markets in the green transition, but obviously also with a potential, you know, providing credit for an otherwise sanctioned Russian economy, should it get to the point where that is needed. I don't know if any of you have a question to Rafael, who asks about the Big Bang. Oh, sorry, who has an answer to that question.
I doubt that, I don't want to say quite drowning can save the drowning, but you know, countries with fiscal issues themselves can necessarily sort of boost this brick bank enough to help each other. I think, you know, Brazil, of course, will stay within the constraints of the fiscal responsibility because of the potential pressure from the market. And I think that's very clear. The market will be very as swift as it was on the UK if Brazil were to try to veer off from that path. In case of Russia, we have the issue where Russia needs the money for itself. And then, of course, China has its own medium-term preparation for the potential confrontation for the US. So I think here, while I see some sort of talk and cooperation and maybe more business engagement, as Clarissa pointed out, sort of more neutral formal statements, but we continue to do business together attitude to as long as it's beneficial to each other. But I do not see any of these countries being capable of bailing out each other just because there isn't enough fiscal capacity in any of the countries involved in the BRIC Bank.
I don't have anything to add, and I follow Irina's, you know.
Okay. Okay. Well, we're getting closer to our witching hour, and therefore I would like to encourage anybody in the audience, if they have a final question to our excellent panelists, now is the time to type it into the Q&A, and I can assure you that we will have time to convey at least the first or the second question in the remaining time that we have. If that's not the case, I have a lot of questions because it is rare that you get to ask such knowledgeable people questions. So I will plow ahead with more questions unless somebody else volunteers. Well, that doesn't seem to be any volunteers, and we have a few minutes left. So I would like to, you know, one thing we haven't, you know, we've talked about decarbonization, we've talked about different sectors, but we haven't touched upon one thing that usually comes in, except very briefly, which is the issue of carbon prices. Obviously, we have a very high one, I might add, about 90 euros per ton in Europe. We have the largest cap and trade system in the world is now the Chinese power sector, but the price is quite low. We obviously have it in some of the US states, in some of the parts of Canada and elsewhere. Now, as an economist, I kind of like the concept. We can debate subsidies, whether it's the subsidy or the stick approach that's best, but I think the price mechanism really works. But we also know the political problems of doing that around the world. So I guess my question is, does it have a more global future? And especially when we start combining it with things about, you know, talks about a carbon club and other discriminatory measures based on carbon prices or carbon content. What would you say to that?
So thank you for bringing this topic to the conversation, Jacob, because as an economist by background, I understand that putting a price on externalities is needed to drive efficient decision-making processes. Having said that, if we look to, you know, the last 10 to 20 years, we've not been, as a global society, efficient in putting a global price on carbon. So apparently it might not be, you know, the best case scenario for all economies, while it is being, I would say, successful in driving decarbonization in some industry sectors in Europe, for instance, or in California or elsewhere. So that's I would say the possession of the ideal solution that would come out of our books, and the real solution that has to do with really how to influence corporate action and driving more investments at a higher speed towards decarbonization technologies. So given the difficulties that we've been facing over the last years, I don't expect a global carbon price anymore. So I don't work with this assumption anymore, although I would say that according to different political arrangements, this could be, and this is already the case in different places. So is it the best way to drive? I would let the researchers answer this question after a few years of really analyzing the data and the pace of decarbonization according to different markets. I like the approach of the carbon club approach. I personally like it because it's through incentivizing, best practice. And by implementing best practice where you operate, then you attract others, to really also implement the best practice at home. Having said that, it is not as spread over as it could be. There are some places, and you mentioned Canada and US, that are partnering to do that, some provinces, etc. But it's not really a global trend. So I guess that we'll have to live with different arrangements, either through incentives or through stakes all over the world. But definitely, my understanding is that the more that we have a pricing approach towards negative externalities, the more efficient and cost-effective the global solution will be.
Very good. Well, we have actually reached our witching hour. So unless you have some very brief final words, Selina.
Just very brief final words is that we need to be conscious that there is market fragmentation, particularly in oil, and part of the market in oil is becoming much more shadow, as you say, not just shadow fleet. And it is a big change from the last maybe 20 years or so when the market was much more together. So I think that's my last comment.
All right. Well, then we have reached our witching hour, and I would like to thank our excellent panelists. I must say I learned a lot. Clarissa Linz and Elena Rybakova. And then my last role here is to hand it over either to Ian Lesser from GMF, or I don't know, yeah, Ian is here. If not, Sergio is on standby, I can say that, to formally conclude today's event. But once again, thank you to my excellent panelists.
Well, Jacob, thank you very much. I am here and was listening with really great interest. This was a fantastic conversation. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF in Brussels, actually. And, let me just add my thanks to all the speakers and to the moderators, including you, Jacob. Thank you very much indeed. Let me also thank the Fundação, and in particular Sergio and all of your colleagues. I mean, we've done a number of these conversations that are sort of essentially trilateral, Brazilian, European, US, transatlantic conversations on different topics. They've all been great in their own way. This was really terrific. I mean, for a lot of different reasons. We talked about maybe doing something broader and geopolitical. We thought, no, these were two issues that were going to be very compelling for people on all sides of the Atlantic. And I think this conversation shows that that was exactly right. I think it also shows that this was an interesting way into talking about a lot of things, in fact. And it came off very, very well. So I want to just add my thanks again to everyone, and also to everyone who joined for this conversation. There were lots of people in the audience. So again, from GMF, thank you. And we look forward to being with you and with the foundation again. Sergio, I don't know, a last word maybe from your side, if you'd like.
No, my last word is a simple one. It's just to thank everybody who has participated in this conversation, and to tell you that we are fully committed to carry on this partnership with the GMF.
With pleasure. Thank you again.
Same here. Bye
All the
bye
best
all.
from Brussels.